There are few figures in Star Wars as haunting as the Emperor's personal guard, the crimson-clad Royal Guard, the silent Sovereign Protectors, and the black-armored Shadow Guard. Each of them was terrifying in their own right, symbols of Palpatine's power and his obsession with loyalty. But standing apart from all of them is something stranger, something more grotesque: the Imperial Sentinels. These were not men chosen for loyalty, they were not elite soldiers elevated through training, they were not ambitious Force adepts clawing their way to power. The Sentinels were engineered from the ground up, cloned in secret facilities, mutated by alchemy, and stripped of will before they could even form unique identities. They were never meant to be individuals, they were never meant to be human. They were half-finished experiments, a halfway perfected attempt from Palpatine to forge a race of living statues who would embody his will. And where they stood tells us everything. Greetings again, acolytes and lore junkies, and welcome back to the channel and the archives. Today, we will be finishing our look at the Imperial Royal Guards, with the most terrifying group of them all, the Imperial Sentinels from the world of Byss. The Sentinels were not stationed on Coruscant where the Emperor paraded his Crimson Guards before the Senate and the galaxy at large. They were stationed on Byss, Palpatine's true throne world. The world where his clone bodies were grown, where the Dark Side Compendium was written, where his most prized secrets and treasures were stored. Byss was not the public face of the Empire, but it was the hidden heart of it. And there, at the core of Sidious's power, the Sentinels stood as his watchers. This is the story of the Imperial Sentinels, half-complete monsters, grotesque guardians, and perhaps the most unsettling creations of Darth Sidious's reign. Part 1. Their origins in alchemy and in science. The origins of the Imperial Sentinels are unlike any other guard class in Palpatine's service. The Royal Guard were elite stormtroopers and soldiers, conditioned to absolute loyalty. The Sovereign Protectors were chosen for their skill, and sometimes even their potential in the Force. Even the Shadow Guards, black-clad assassins with lightsaber pikes, were born men, trained, indoctrinated, and erased until their voices were gone. But the Sentinels are different. They were not born, they were grown. Deep within the secret cloning facility of the world of Byss, tissue stock was used to begin their growth. During their gestation, chemicals were introduced that suppressed higher brain functions, speech, independence, imagination, even the ability to resist orders. These chemicals created blank slates, beings who could move, fight, and obey, but who would never think for themselves. And on top of this, Dark Side adepts performed alchemy, mutating and growing clones into hulking giants. This alone sets the Sentinels apart from the other classes of the guards. Sith alchemy was an art of the ancient Sith, used to twist flesh, forge monsters, and to bind the dark side into unnatural vessels. In the era of the Rule of Two, it was almost unheard of. Darth Bane had dismissed it largely. Sidious himself usually relied on politics, apprentices, and his mastery in other methods of the Force. But the Sentinels were proof that he indulged in alchemy directly, and the results are disturbing ones. His cultists attempted to create mental bonds with their Sentinels, tying them to their will. If the process succeeded, the Sentinels became a living puppet, utterly reliant on its master for purpose and direction. If it failed, the creature was destroyed instantly. Rumors circulated even among the adepts that the first generation of Sentinels had been cloned from Force-sensitive stock. The early versions were immensely powerful, but unstable to the point of madness. Their sensitivity to the dark side clashed with their chemical suppression, creating insane hulks that could not be controlled. Later generations were deliberately dulled, stripped of whatever Force potentials their predecessors had possessed. This made them far weaker, but manageable. In this sense, the Sentinels were always incomplete. They were halfway successes, terrifying in presence, but flawed in design, never perfected. They were a glimpse at what Palpatine wanted, an army of alchemical soldiers bred for loyalty. But what they also were was a reminder of his limits. Now we reach part 2, their history. The Sentinels' history spans the final days of the Republic through the last moments of Palpatine's reborn Dark Empire, but their appearances are always rare, always shrouded in secrecy and importance. Their first appearance was as early as 19 BBY in the Purge of Ashkaboda. Their first known deployment came at the dawn of the Empire, during the Great Jedi Purge. On an unnamed planet, several Jedi had been captured. Among them was the Jedi Master Ashkaboda, a member of the Librarians' Assembly. The Sentinels appeared at the battlefield carrying authentic Imperial data chips. They took custody of Boda, loaded him onto their dungeon ship, and brought him to Coruscant. There, Palpatine had Boda tortured and then executed. But what mattered most was what Boda carried, the Tedran holocron. This holocron contained the wisdom of the ancients, Jedi Masters, and Palpatine used it to compose the Book of Anger, the first volume of his Dark Side Compendium. In this way, the Imperial Sentinels are directly tied to one of the most infamous works of Sith philosophy in galactic history. Then we reach the early Imperial era, the Sarlacc Project. First-generation Sentinels were also stationed aboard the Golan defense platform guarding a Super Star Destroyer prototype above the world of Byss. They were stationed at the so-called Sarlacc Project. Alderaanian resistance agents who infiltrated the station confronted the Sentinels in Docking Bay 616, learning firsthand what these giants were capable of. And then we reach 2 BBY, their early sightings. As of 2 BBY, the Sentinels are still rarely seen outside of Byss. But occasionally, they did make public appearances, usually transporting Force users in custody. These brief sightings created wild rumors within the Imperial courts. Some whispered that the Sentinels were cyborgs or droids. Others claimed that they were remnants of a giant species enslaved by Palpatine. Some even speculated that they were rebels who had dared to defy the Emperor, transformed into Hulks as punishment for their crime. And then comes the Galactic Civil War. Rumors and whispers within the rebellion. Rumors of the Sentinels spread like ghost stories. Giant armored warriors who stood at the Emperor's side, his most terrifying enforcers. But few had ever seen them, and fewer still had survived. 10 years after the Battle of Yavin, the Dark Empire. It was not until Palpatine's rebirth on Byss that the Sentinels were unleashed more openly. During Operation Shadowhand, they were seen guarding the Emperor's citadel, patrolling cloning facilities, and working alongside Imperial Dungeoneers on dungeon ships. It was during this time that Luke Skywalker, after defecting to Palpatine, would even breed 2 Sentinels of his own. These Hulks would escort Han Solo, Leia Organa, and C-3PO to Palpatine's personal clone labs, where they attempted to rescue Luke. When one of the Sentinels restrained Han, Leia ignited her lightsaber and severed the creature's hand. It did not scream. It simply obeyed until it was destroyed. 11 years after the Battle of Yavin and the fall of Byss, the Sentinel's fate was tied to Byss itself. When R2-D2 sabotaged the hyperdrive of the Eclipse II, sending it crashing into the Galaxy Gun, the resulting misfire destroyed the world of Byss. With it went Palpatine's cloning facilities, his hidden empire, and the Sentinels. Most of them were obliterated, erased with the world that they had been built to protect and serve. But what of their powers and abilities? The terror of the Sentinels was not only their story, it is what they were. They were gargantuan, twice the height and strength of any ordinary man, towering even above the Emperor's Crimson Elite Guards. Their sheer size made them capable of overpowering almost any opponent through brute force alone. Their primary weapons were massive vibro axes, sized to match their bulk. They also carried blasters when needed. Despite their size though, they were trained in unarmed martial arts and even beast riding, further proof that they were meant to function as more than just statues. They wore heavy battle armor beneath long reddish-purple cloaks emblazoned with golden designs. Their helmets concealed their faces entirely, revealing only glowing red eyes. No flesh was ever visible. This gave them the appearance of living statues, faceless, unyielding. What made them most unnatural, though, was their alchemical alterations. Through Sith sorcery, their bodies were warped, their minds were blanked. Rumors held that adepts could even see through their eyes, making them literal extensions of their masters. But here lies the greatest uncertainty. Were they Force users? The truth is complicated. The earliest generations of the Sentinels may very well have been. Their raw connection to the dark side made them dangerously unstable, but later versions were deliberately dulled. They had no conscious mastery of the Force. Instead, they existed as Force perversions, bodies twisted by alchemy, saturated in corruption, radiating the dark side but not wielding it per se. In a sense, they were terrifying not because of what they could do, but because of what they represented. They were empty vessels touched by the Force, proof of Palpatine's desire to create life not for the sake of life, but for the sake of obedience and the glorification of self. To be a Sith was to subscribe to the worship of self. The Sentinels were not for display though, they were not for ceremony. They were stationed exclusively on Byss, where Palpatine was at his most vulnerable. They stood guard over the Citadel, his cloning facilities, his personal labs. Some even protected restricted areas of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant. But they also functioned as escorts for Palpatine's adepts. Whenever one of his inner circle was dispatched on a high-priority mission, Sentinels would accompany them off-world. Their presence was both protective and symbolic, a sign that the adepts spoke with the Emperor's authority. But above all, they were symbols of fear. Their sheer size, their silence, their facelessness, all of it made them more terrifying than stormtroopers, more unnerving than inquisitors. They were the mute hulks of Byss, rarely seen, never explained, and always lethal. So with all of that said, how did the Imperial Sentinels really stack up against Palpatine's other guards? This is one of our favorite thought exercises when we look at all of the guards. To answer that, we need to place them in the larger lineage of elite warriors who served the Emperor. From the mercenary Sun Guard, to the Crimson Royal Guard, to the black-clad Shadow Guard, all the way to the Sovereign Protectors. Each rung of the pyramid represented a refinement of loyalty, power, and skill. At the base, the Sun Guards of Thyresis, mercenaries whose discipline and martial prowess first inspired Palpatine's model for the elite guards. The Sun Guards who had fanatically followed his own master Darth Plagueis. Above them, the Imperial Royal Guard, handpicked from the Emperor's best soldiers, trained on Yin Chor, and molded into silent Crimson Sentinels of loyalty. Then came the Shadow Guards, royal guards with Force sensitivity, their identities broken away and their voices erased, armed with lightsaber pikes to hunt Jedi and to silence dark side rivals. At its peak, the Sovereign Protectors, Palpatine's most elite guardians, stationed on Byss itself, not all wielders of the Force, but some like Karnor Jax, powerful enough to receive formal training from the Sith. And then you have the Imperial Sentinels. They do not sit neatly inside of this pyramid. They weren't men elevated to higher service. They were grown as grotesque creations, engineered husks clad in ceremonial armor, lacking the finesse of the Sovereigns, the speed of the Shadows, and even the tactical minds of the Crimson Guards. What they possessed was something entirely different, a terrifying absence of will. But what makes them terrifying is not what they were, but what they may have become. In their final form, the Sovereign Protectors clearly stood above all of them in skill and refinement. But the Sentinels were the only guard Force engineered from conception, born not as men, but as husks sculpted by alchemy. If Palpatine had perfected this process, stabilizing Force sensitivity, fusing their immense physical strength with true mastery of the dark side, the Sentinels could have eclipsed every other guard by a huge margin. Imagine an entire corps of towering giants, loyal from birth, wielding the Force with the same tireless obedience that they already embodied. No ambition, no betrayal, no hesitation. Only the Emperor's will given flesh. It never came to pass. They remained incomplete, destroyed on Byss. But in their shadow lingers the nightmare of their potential. A glimpse at what Palpatine truly desired. An army not of men, but of monsters. Monsters who would have stood as the ultimate guardians of the eternal empire. What I find most interesting about the Imperial Sentinels is how they weren't just a late Dark Empire creation. At least some of them were already around in the early days of the Empire, tied directly to Ashka Boda and the Tedran Holocron. That means Palpatine was experimenting with these alchemical giants almost from the very beginning, likely even when he was the Supreme Chancellor, the humble Palpatine. They serve as a reminder of how fascinating the lore in the world of Byss is also. Palpatine's true throne, steeped in secrets, clone vats, and dark side corruption. Byss is unique in Star Wars because it's not just another fortress world, it was the Emperor's hidden heart. I like the idea of the Sentinels being the final stop of the Guardsman ladder, the grotesque endpoint of the Sun Guards, the Royal Guards, the Shadow Guards, and the Sovereign Protectors. But the truth is that they failed. They were incomplete experiments, and the Sovereign Protectors remained the clear number one in Palpatine's hierarchy. If the two ever matched against each other, I think the outcome is clear. A Sentinel's sheer size and strength might overwhelm an opponent at first, but the Sovereign Protectors' refined skill, and in the case of Karnor Jax, the use of the dark side, would cut them down. The Sentinels were terrifying in presence, but the Sovereigns were perfected. In the end, the Sentinels stand as one of the strangest footnotes of Palpatine's empire, half-finished monsters whose legacy lies not in what they achieved, but in the haunting glimpse of what they could have become. But anyway, my friends and lore junkies, I hope you've been enjoying our deep dive into the Guardsmen of Darth Sidious and the Empire. What are your thoughts on the Imperial Sentinels? And do you think that we got it wrong? How would they fare against the Sovereign Protectors? Thanks so much guys for visiting the channel, and as always, may the Force be with you.